I'm Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic. Welcome to a Way Out book study. You're muted, Howard.
You may regret telling me that. My name is Howard Eber, and I am a recovered alcoholic and addict.
All right. So, um, I'm going to turn over to Howard beginning because he wanted to go over some stuff that we didn't have enough time on last week before we get to how it works this week. He has some stuff that we close out We Agnostics with. He wanted to go over.
Yeah. Um, where I'm going to pick up is on page 55, the last paragraph. What I want to talk about is who I want to talk about actually is Fitz Mayo. Fitz Mayo is a rather important person in our history. You can't hear that, right? Okay, good. Because she's barking like crazy. Okay. Uh, Rob, can you give me which one is it? It's 411. And incidentally, I put Rob has put a couple of other PDFs in the chat that you may want to make click on and make a copy of before we get too deep into the meeting because you'll need them. This isn't it though. This is just some information on who we're talking about. Fitz Mayo. He wrote Our Southern Friend was in the big book. He was considered number eight recovered person in New York. But he's I'm sorry, number eight in total, number three in Towns Hospital. The number two guy in Towns Hospital was Hank Parkhurst. Then Bill got and Hank got Fitz sober. Fitz was a childhood friend of Jimmy Burwell. And as you'll see, some of this other biographical information is covered in this story, but that's the guy we're talking about right here. Okay. Let's take a look at 55.5. In this book, you'll read, Rob, you could take that down. You could read the experience of a man who thought he was a racist, an atheist, thought. Um, his story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart, and that refers to his eventual spiritual experience, was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Incidentally, we read about Fitz earlier in the doctor's opinion, where he was the guy who hid out in a deserted barn, determined to drink himself to death. He was found, rescued, and brought to Towns Hospital. Fitz is a very important person in our history for a number of reasons. When the book was written and Bill had decided that the title was going to be The Way Out by Alcoholics Anonymous, he had the vision, he had the foresight to wonder, are there other books in circulation now using a title like that? So he asked Fitz, who lived closer to Washington, D.C. than Bill did. Fitz lived in Virginia. Doesn't mean much to you guys in the UK, but for those who live here, he lived in Virginia, closer to the Library of Congress. He went there and he came back and he told Bill there are a lot of books with titles like that. Now you'll hear stories. Some people say he found 12. Ooh, 12, like the 12 steps, or he found 36, like the steps, the traditions, and the concepts. You'll hear all kind of cockamamie stories. There's even one that said he found 55 of them because that's where his story is in the book. It's nonsense. We don't know how many he found. The point is, he found a number of books with titles like that, and Bill decided let's maybe think of something else. Fitz came up with the idea, why don't we just call it Alcoholics Anonymous? Instead of by Alcoholics Anonymous, let's just call it Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill liked it, and Dr. Bob liked it. And then Bob told a little fib to Bill. He told him, I discussed it with everybody in Akron, and they're in favor of it. But you know, nobody in Akron was in favor of the book at all. So he didn't ask anyone, maybe his wife, but he agreed to it. And so that's how we got the title of our book, from Fitz Mayo. And just one last sad note. Fitz died in 1943 of cancer. He died sober of cancer at the age of 46. Why is that sad? Obviously, he died at a young age, but he never got to see Alcoholics Anonymous become what it became. The Jack Alexander article hadn't been written. None of these things had been done, but it hadn't grown the way it was shortly after he passed away. So I think that's kind of sad. But okay, let's get back to this. His change of heart was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school where he became rebellious at what he thought an overdose of religious education. Now, that's not a minor point. Let me just read something here. He said he became rebellious at an overdose of religious education. First of all, can anybody identify with that? I had to go to Hebrew school every day after regular school from 3:30 to 5:30 between the ages of 9 and 14. Every day I had to go to Hebrew school for religious training, and I hated it. So I know how he must have felt. But the point that I want to make here is it said he became rebellious, and that's not a minor point. It says, it infers, well, actually, it's more than infers, it states that his atheism is reactionary, that his atheism is a rebellion against his upbringing, that it's not a reasoned conclusion, that his disbelief is viewed as discontent, that he's judging something based on background, not on background, but on content. The resistance comes from religious defiance rather than discernment. Important point. That means his atheism is more of a protest than it is of his seriousness of feeling that way. Just a minor point that it kind of diminishes the significance of his being an atheist because it came as a rebellious act. It wasn't something he thought about, read about, and came to conclusions about. Be that as that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. For years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration, business failure, insanity, fatal illness, suicide. Um, these calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, ever more serious alcoholism, impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. Again, that self-destruction is he went to a deserted bar and locked himself in and decided he was going to drink himself to death. Um, in other words, Fitz has hit a bottom. Okay. He's got philosophical disillusionment mixed with emotional breakdown from all these calamities in his life. This all implies disbelief, atheism is fed by despair. So once again, his atheism comes as a reaction. It came from a reaction and a rebellion against his upbringing, and it came as a reaction to the disillusionment and emotional breakdown that he was dealing with. It becomes what I'm saying, I guess, is this becomes more of a morality play, that atheism leads to ruin and disbelief, and atheism rather leads to ruin. Belief leads to salvation. That's the morality play that we're being presented with here. Here's a guy who became an atheist, not by research, but by reaction. So atheism comes from ruin. Belief comes from salvation, leads to salvation. Just a point. Continuing, one night when confined in a hospital, that's Towns Hospital, he was approached. You may want to make note of the fact that he was approached. Uh, Bill didn't give him a call and say, come on, call on me. Bill approached him. One more reason to believe that our job is to approach, not to wait to be approached. He was approached by an alcoholic, Bill Wilson, who had known a spiritual experience. Footnote, Hank didn't have a spiritual experience. Never talked about it. He never had one. So we're talking about here, the guy who came in after Hank had a spiritual experience like Bill's. Hank had no spiritual experience. Hank drank. Kind of rhymes, but maybe there's a connection there. Okay. Um, who had known a spiritual experience. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there is a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me." Um, but later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I have known are wrong? Ask yourself, if the millions, and I'm going to change your word, I'm going to change religious people to recovered alcoholics. But ask yourself if millions of recovered alcoholics who say they've been restored to happy, useful, productive lives by practicing these spiritual principles, these steps, can they all be full of shit? That's the question he's asking himself about all the religious people. So if we have doubts, let's just look around us. Is everybody telling the same fib? Maybe it's true. And that should give us enough reason to look into it, to consider it, to ponder what's being presented to us, some new information that we're going to need for the next chapter. Maybe the millions of recovered people are enough of a reason for us to give it a shot. While pondering the answer, he felt as though he lived in hell. Then, like a thunderbolt, Fitz uses the word thunderbolt. What did Bill call it? Sudden and profound. Means the same thing. Thunderbolt, a great thought came. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? And I think there should be a sentence that follows that. It should be, who are you to say there is no God in a world that shows me there is one? Again, just my opinion, but I think it should be there. The man recounts he tumbled out of his bed to his knees. In a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. Sudden spiritual experience. Same thing that Bill had. The barriers he had built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and love. Capital, 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 capital. God. Presence, infinite power, love. Rob, can you put up 53.3, please? The next sentence I've got highlighted. He stepped from bridge to shore. The bridge is the bridge of reason. He stepped across the bridge of reason to the solid ground of faith. We start with this flimsy reed of belief. You know, a flimsy reed you ever see in a swamp, what a reed looks like? It's just this stalk, this thin stalk that if you grabbed onto would crack and disappear in your hand. That's how what we were holding on to in the beginning, this flimsy reed of belief. And then we cross the bridge of reason, the agnostic's higher power, reason, the ability to come to and form our own conclusions. And based on that, we then step on the desired shore of faith. And that's what Fitz's experience. He started with this flimsy reed of belief. He crossed the bridge of reason and he landed on the solid shore of faith. He doesn't believe anymore because belief is hope. He knows. And that's what faith is. Faith is conviction, knowledge, certainty. Belief is hope. He now has the faith that's necessary. You could take that down, Rob. For the first time, he lived in conscious companionship with his creator. In other words, in harmony. He has entered the world of the spirit. Another way of saying that, he's living in the fourth dimension. Because remember, the fourth dimension is a harmonious blend of the other three, spiritual, mental, and physical. So conscious companionship means he's in harmony, spiritually, mentally, and physically. Thus was our friend's cornerstone fixed in place. The cornerstone, without putting up the picture of the spiritual arch, is that cornerstone that holds the arch together. I'm sorry, the cornerstone is the cornerstone that keeps the arch plumb and level, right? Isn't that what it is? It's the cornerstone next to the foundation that keeps the arch level, then builds up the sides, which are the rest of the steps, and the top of the arch is held together by the, isn't that the cornerstone?
Correct.
Yeah, right? I'm a little
Yeah,
confused.
that supports the that side of the building.
Almost triangular stone that holds it together. That's the cornerstone. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Thus was our friend's cornerstone fixed in place. No later vicissitude has shaken it. Vicissitude is just another way of saying change in life circumstances, calamities. We mentioned the word calamities earlier. This is another way of saying it. Vicissitudes are changes in one's life for the worse. It's not good news. It's vicissitudes are bad changes. His alcoholic problem was taken away that very night years ago. It disappeared, save for a few brief moments of temptation. The thought of a drink has never returned. Has never returned tells me he has achieved permanent sobriety. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's a reference to permanent sobriety. If it has never returned, and basically, at such times, a great revulsion has risen up in him. Basically, he would recoil as if from a hot flame. Sound familiar? See page 84 if you're looking for that quote. But he's saying the same thing, that he'd recoil as if from a hot flame, that a great revulsion rises in him. Seemingly, he could not drink even if he would. God had restored his sanity. What is this but a miracle of healing? Miracle, if you want to look it up in a dictionary in 1939, is defined as as an incident displaying divine intervention in human affairs. An incident demonstrating divine intervention in human affairs. That's a miracle. The hand of God. Um, Yet its elements are simple. Circumstances made him willing to believe. Now, whenever I do this with the sponsee, I ask them the question I'm going to suggest you write down somewhere on this page, which is, what circumstance made me willing? There's 29 people here today. I guarantee there are 29 different circumstances that made us willing. For me, for years in recovery, 24 years to be precise, whenever I'd hear somebody talk about suicide, I'd think, what a weak son of a bitch. That is, that's the easy way out. I never could condone that, and I never could take that seriously. I was in such a bad place when I came back from my last relapse that emotionally, I was in the kind of pain where that made sense. And that was the circumstance that made me willing. I started to view suicide as a viable option to my problems. That's my circumstance. What's yours? We all have different circumstances that make us willing. So he humbly offered himself to his maker, God, and then he knew. In other words, then he had faith. Faith is knowledge, certainty, not belief. Even so has God restored us all, the 100 or 40 or 70 or whatever number you want to assign, again, with the numbers. He's talking about the originals, whatever you want to call them, the Magnificent Seven, whatever makes you happy. Has restored us all to our right minds, our sanity. To this man, the revolution was sudden. A spiritual experience is sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly. A spiritual awakening is something we grow into slowly, of the educational variety, right? We read about it in the appendix. But he has come to all, you may want to underline that word, all who have sought him. When we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. In other words, when we open the door to the possibility and ponder that there might be, consider that there might be this beneficial power greater than ourselves, God will then prove to us that there is a God. And that's what he's saying here. When we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. God has proven, just might prove to us that there is a God. And if you need proof of that, when we get to the so-called nine-step promises on 83 and 84, we suddenly realize that God is doing what we couldn't do for ourselves. So something's happening between this page and that page that takes us from maybe there is a God to experiencing that power in our life. All right, I'm going to step aside and let Rob open up on how it works.
You mean you call me Rob, but I'll take as a
I
compliment.
did? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Steve.
Uh, I got a little more hair. No, I'm just kidding. Um, so wow, that's some good information, Howard. So we're entering this chapter, and it's a very important chapter, and but it's also some important qualifications to get to that chapter. And so counting Docker's opinion, we've covered 65 pages, give or take, on the first two steps. And step one, we admitted we're powers of alcohol, dash our lives become unmanageable. And it asks us on the book on page 30 to consider in oneself are alcoholic. Well, I can't do that unless I know what an alcoholic is. And we covered that in Doc's opinion, where we learned the medical aspect of recovery, the mental obsession, where we have no defense against the first drink. And we have a physical allergy where we have no defense against the second drink. So it's like basically I keep going and going and going. Meaning when we put alcohol in our body, we crave more. Normal people don't do that. And any physical problem we have experienced in life that creates pain, it's an easy choice. Don't do it again unless you have a mental obsession that lacks choice and it takes away probably one of our greatest powers we have is reason, right? We lose reason. You- I get a job, it doesn't care. I got a new baby, it doesn't care. You know, yeah, I might go to jail, it doesn't care. My wife might leave me, it doesn't care. None of this stuff comes to mind because of that obsession. I'm always going to go back to it against my will. I'm going to use it against my will. And that's like they'd say it's a merciless obsession. And in Bill's story, we learned the unmanageability, the miracle of recovery. Then in two chapters, um, that would be there's a solution and more about alcoholism. It hammered home more about, why we're powerless. And, he wants no lurking notion at all. If we start to see that we can safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once we reach that place, that's when I can concede in my innermost self. And step two says, come to believe a power greater than self creates source of sanity. And for that, we agnostics over the last like 5 or 6 weeks. And, we talk about how we find the power and how we find the power, steps 4 through 9, and where we find the power we covered last week, deep down within us. And there's, you know, page 47 asks us, do I believe or I'm willing to believe there's a power greater than myself? That's where I take my responsibilities to do step two. But as soon as that person, can is willing to believe, we're done with step two. And you know, I mean, it's easy questions. Are we powerless or not? We're either seek God or we don't. God is everything or he's nothing. What is our choice to be? And I can do steps 1 and 2 100 million times. It's not gonna change me. I can know this book all the way up to how it works, like the back of my hand. It's not gonna change me. You know, so in this chapter, how it works. I mean, let's just look at this backdrop for a second. In 1937, give or take, when this book started to be written, A was, I mean, what would become AA, or what you say is A was on fire, and there's who knows how many members. They say 40, there's 20, 30, who knows, maybe even five, I don't know. But they came up with the idea to help bring this message, to places other than where they lived, and there was no money. They came up with this book of experience idea, which would, as Howard says, which would, change the different titles and stuff. And, um, and Bill never written a book before. He had 3 years. And the first three chapters flowed because it's about drinking and about spiritual ideas. But the next chapter was so important how it works. It is the solution, how the solution work, how these rest of these action steps going to work. Imagine just the pressure on his shoulders he put himself on there, especially with the way we know Bill thinks. You know, he's a very OCD type of person, but he came up with a spiritual plan that he had to come up with a spiritual plan that connected to this real hard-headed alcoholic. And this chapter does not, you know, it needed to connect, you know, and it had to truly flow, and it does. And this chapter is where we truly, I guess you could say, begin our journey because, how to seek the power. This is where we put our foot forward, and like I said, the it and how it works is how the solution works, for how 429 works. And this chapter covers, you know, in steps 3 and 4 in very precise, clear-cut directions. It's funny if you ask a person in a meeting, because how it works is held up in this high pedestal, what chapter in this, and half the people never even done anything in this chapter or got past the first 2 pages or 3 pages, and they'll go, oh, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No, it's 3 and 4, and they go through them perfectly. But remember, in Docker's opinion, Soper said the plan of recovery is covered in masterful details later in this book. He's referring to how it works and into action as well. But this is where it truly starts to follow the directions in this chapter. We start to follow directions, and if you do, that's where we change. This is where the book study like this gets fun because it turns more into a workshop. Because Howard and I are not just going to explain to you what's in this book. We're going to explain to you how we did this stuff. You know, we're going to take our time doing this, so like we usually do, but we're going to look at this slowly. We want to leave no stone unturned. Kind of goes with the thoroughness of this page we're going to look at, and but we're going to go over, like we'll go over instincts in step 4, and what the words mean, what fear means, stuff like that. But we want everyone to have just a better understanding. And my goal is always this: if one person gains one person gets a better understanding, that's all that matters to me. We've done our job. So in reading this tonight, we might refer to the original manuscript, and there's a book that started it all. And the thing is when you write a book, you come up with a rough draft, and that can be, probably handwritten, let's just say, and ideas. And so from the rough draft, it molds into what's called a type manuscript. And you submit that to a publisher, and then they might give you more ideas. They'll go back, and Bill had an army surrounded him. So, and we're going to be referring to that a little bit. Let me show you something really quick. I'm going to share the screen really quick, and because Howard and I are going to do our best to make sense of this. This is an example of the book that started all this pencil writing is all different, A members circling what needs to be changed. And so there's a lot of things that are interesting here and words that are different and rewritten. And we're gonna do, go over that. So but that's where it gets fun. That's where it gets fun. And we're gonna try to go through each sentence. And I've been to probably, God, what, 5,000 meetings in my life. Well, that's a lot of how it works right there. And when it's read, people often wander and drift off and they tone out. They don't even hear it. Sometimes a reader will say whenever instead of wherever when they read step 8. But people just drift off. But once you do the steps and you hear how it works, you sit there and you kind of go, yep. And it's like talking to you. And I was just, what's the last time you really listened to what's saying there? What it means, incapable of grasping and develop management, which drags rigorous honesty. So we're gonna comb through that first page because we heard it so many times. Maybe we give someone a different perspective and understanding on it. And I remember being at a book study years ago, and this my friend Wally, his name was. He was from Scotland, and so you get in front of the group, and he would say, "Gentlemen, this is where the rubber meets the road." And right before we got the step three in there, and this chapter is where the rubber meets the road. You know, where the rubber meets the road is where it really gets serious and true. And you know, let's say I always use this analogy. Let's say I'm on a fishing boat. The moment of truth is when I put the boat in the water. Will it work? And we spent a lot of time on the first two steps. You know, and from what we get out of this book is we know we need help. We've seen others awaken from this. We've heard their stories. We've heard promises. You know, the moment of truth is seek God and take action. Do we want a better way of life? You know, I knew this chapter like the back of my hand, one, two, and three, but I had no time. You know, I never got past the third step. I knew I could tell you steps one and two really well. I remember 12 stepping someone one time loaded, talk about the allergy obsession of someone. But anyways, um, Howard, you want to comment on that before I get into, oh, he's deep into the safe. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Um, sorry. What I wanted to do, since I started out talking about history, is I wanted to go back to history and talk a little bit about, Steve mentioned the manuscript. And when we go through the first few pages, we're going to read what was originally written and compare it to what appears in the book today. But more importantly, by this time in the writing process, I can almost envision Bill sitting back and thinking, well, I've thoroughly reviewed the problem in the doctor's opinion and chapter one to some extent in my story and part of chapter two. There's a solution. I've told them what's going to happen if they don't find the solution in More About Alcoholism. And then I gave them some new ideas about this higher power business in We Agnostic. So I've done the preliminary work. It's now time to outline this program of action that I've been talking about for 50 some odd pages. Remember, he told us earlier, the main purpose of the book is to enable you to find a power which will solve your problem. So it's about time I told them what the roadmap is like to find that power. So he set out to write what I think is arguably the most significant pattern for living since the Ten Commandments was Sermon on the Mount. That's how important I think this is. According to Dr. Bob, he said, I think this is one of the greatest instances of divine inspiration in human history. That's what he said about the first 3 pages of how it works.
Wow.
Must be good, right? Uh, Rob, can I get it is Rob, right? Rob, can I get 5-4? A lot of what I'm going to show you is in, as Rob mentioned, as Steve mentioned. Why do I have Rob on my mind? Oh well. Rob, did we lose Rob? Oh, okay. Okay. It was now realized that we had enough background, window dressing material that at this point we'd have to tell how our program of recovery really worked. The backbone of the book would have to be fit in right here. Now, please bear in mind, this was written in 1957. Okay. This was taken out of Alcoholics AA Comes of Age, printed in 1957. The dates are important. So please remember these dates. Okay. Let's continue to the next page. So that was the assignment. Now, here's what they came up with. Since Ebby's visit in the fall of 1934, and this is taken also from AA Comes of Age, published in 1957. Bill said, since Ebby's visit in the fall of 34, we had gradually evolved what we called the word of mouth program. Most of the basic ideas came from the Oxford groups, William James, and Dr. Silkworth, though subject to variable consideration. It's an interesting term for the steps, isn't it? Subject to variable variation, considerable variation. It all boiled down into a pretty consistent procedure which comprised 6 steps. They are approximately, not exactly, they are approximately as follows. 1, we admitted we were licked to a powerless over alcohol. 2, we made a moral inventory. And you could read the rest of those. I don't want to take all of the time to read those things. But that's what Bill said was the quote, substance. In the fall of 1938, we were telling newcomers, please bear in mind that he said that in 1957. In 1957, he's describing something that happened in 1938. Okay? Rob, can I get the next page? In the big book, he sold himself short. In Earl Treat's story, he lists out the 6 steps that Dr. Bob worked with him. Complete deflation, dependence, guidance, moral inventory, and so on. So you see, this is not exactly what we were told about earlier. This is something that appears in the big book, and people use it as proof that there were 6 steps in the beginning because it says so in Earl Treat's story. Earl Treat's story was written in 1955, not 1938, not 1937. So in 1955, he's writing about something that took place in 1937. These dates are important. Please keep them in mind. So these 6 steps are a little bit different than the other 6 steps we read. Rob, let's go to the next one. In July of 53, in Grapevine, Bill wrote a fragment of history, the origin of the 12 steps. It was later reproduced in Language of the Heart. But this is what Bill wrote in 1953 about something that happened in 1939. During the next 3 years after Dr. Bob's recovery of our growing groups in Akron, New York, and Cleveland evolved the so-called word of mouth program of our pioneering time. As we commenced to form a society separate from the Oxford group, we began to state our principles something like this. So once again, not exactly, approximately something like this. And again, you could look at them and see that they're different from the other 2 that we just read about. And then he went on to say these principles were advocated as this, according to the whim or liking of each of us. This was the gist of our message to incoming alcoholics up to 1939, written in 1953. So far, we've heard about writing in 53 and 55 and 56 about things that happened 20 years earlier. Next one, if you wouldn't mind. How did he write the steps? He wrote the 12 steps while lying in bed at 182 Clinton Street with a pad of pencil in his hand and a yellow pad on his knee. Now, again, as we just saw, in using terms like word of mouth, gist, subject to considerable variation, approximately, according to the whim, it's clear that the need for consistency was crucial before the program became distorted and diluted. So, his assignment, we're finally getting down to what is it he did. His assignment was to state the program in writing, no more word of mouth. Now let's look at how he wrote those first few pages. In Language of the Heart, fragment of history, Bill says, I remember the evening on which the 12 steps were written. I was lying in bed, quite dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. 4 chapters of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, had been roughed out and read in meetings in Akron and New York. Let's stop there and go to the next page, if you would. I don't want to read all of this. He said, on this particular evening, as my mind ran over these developments, it seemed to me that the program was still not definite enough. Our literature would have to be as clear and comprehensive as possible. Our steps would have to be more explicit. There must not be a single loophole through which the rationalizing alcoholic could wiggle. Finally, I started to write, and just jumping down a few lines, he said, I completed the first draft. It took perhaps half an hour. So the first 3 pages of how it works that contain the most important, I think, the most important spiritual guide for living, the 12 steps, was written in less than 30 minutes. The words kept right on coming. At this moment, a couple of late callers arrived. One of them, and I love this, the first person he read the 12 steps to, you know what his name was? Howard. Gotta love that. Gotta love that. At least I do. Um, Howard came in as a newcomer. I was pretty pleased with what I'd written, and I read them the new version of the steps. Howard and his friends reacted violently. Why 12 steps? You've got too much God. You'll scare people away. What do you mean getting these drunks down on their knees? And you'll see later what that's about. What do you mean to ask to have all of their shortcomings removed? Who needs all of the shortcomings removed anyhow? You got to tone it down. It's too stiff. So Bill says, I sprang to the defense of my new creation, every word of it. A terrific discussion developed, which only cooled when Lois showed up a couple of hours later. So Bill and these two guys are debating what he just read, the 12 steps, for a couple of hours. And Lois said, why don't you forget about it for a while? Have a cup of coffee. And we did. But the next day, Bill was just as adamant about what he had written as he was the night before. And so he started to present it. Uh, well, we're not up to that yet, but he started to present it to the people in Akron, gave it to Dr. Bob. And that is when the proverbial shit hit the fan. Um, Bill, people were saying this sounds too much like the Oxford groups, and you got too much God in there. And the people in New York didn't want God anywhere in it. They wanted a more psychological book. Um, Bill this and Bill that. And then you can go to the next page, Rob. As the one who had to do the writing, I was caught squarely in the middle of the arguing. For a while, it looked as if we would bog down into permanent disagreement. Despairing of satisfying everyone, I finally asked I be the final judge. Seeing we would get nowhere without a point of decision, they agreed. 1957. He's talking about something that happened, what, 20 years earlier, 1938. Um, so Bill agreed to make some modifications. But his deal was after I make the changes in the first 3 pages of how it works, I'm the final arbiter. What goes in the book is up to me. I'll listen to everybody, but I make the final decision. And if that's not okay with everybody, take the book and finish it yourself. I'm done. We're not going to debate these things anymore. That's the story. That's the story that Bill told over and over and over again about how this was written. Let's go to the next page. Oh, no, you can pass that. That's Bill's Shaberg story. Um, actually, go to slide number 9. Do you have 9? One before it, I think. Well, okay, let me just take that down if you would. I want to save time. We're running out of time. What I just read is what Bill wants us to believe, right? He's told that story over and over and over again in 55 and 56 and 53, all based on something that happened in 38 and 39. Now let's look at what it is he said. He said that there was this enormous battle over every word. Well, in writing the big book, Bill Shaberg states that Akron's response right up to the middle of November. Oh, Rob, you can put that last page up. I just realized that is the right page. I'm sorry. Right up to the middle of November of 38, was simply to say that they liked the chapters that were already being sent. Given this disappointing lack of response, Bill complained to Bob that he wished he could be, that Bill would, no, next one, there it is, that one. He wished that Dr. Bob would be more critical. He said, I think it can be improved a lot. And he elsewhere noted that despite the fact that each of the chapters were sent to Ohio for debate and inspection, Dr. Bob never, never passed them around, merely saying he thought they were all right, Bill. Keep writing. He didn't present the pages to anyone in Akron because the people in Akron didn't want a book. They didn't care for Bill and his great schemes. They've wanted to just let's work one on one with other alcoholics. It's working so far. We don't need to go any further. So there was no contention. Well, maybe there was in New York. So things in New York were a bit different, but not different enough to generate the kind of serious criticism he'd written about what he'd written. He said, I found it hard to get people to voice their opinions as they are too much afraid of hurting my feelings. Whatever reasons there might be for the New York reticence to make comments, the result, and this is important, Bill was writing in a virtual vacuum with very little substantive feedback. So there was no battle over every word and every sentence and every, it's all Bill's telling a story. Uh, do we have any other pages after that? Oh, yeah. As Ruth later noted, the major changes were made in the office. They were fought out by the people in the office. Who was in the office when the book was written? Hank, Bill, Fitz, and Ruth Haack. And Jim Burwell consistently claimed that he was part of that group. So let's throw him in for the hell of it anyway. So that's the group that was deciding what was in the book. Any changes that were made by those guys, not by the contingent in Akron, not by the contingent in New York, because they didn't give a damn. Certainly in Akron, they just didn't. So um, we have another page. I, okay, it's perfectly reasonable to wonder where this popular creation story came from. One reason for the duplicity was the need to bolster the illusion that the book was a report of a collective experience. 100 men and women have recovered, and we're telling you their story. So rather than that, it was a condensed version of Bill's personal experiences and observations during his first 4 years of sobriety, which for the most part is exactly what this was about. The power of the communal experience, rather than that of one individual, was increasingly recognized as one of the most important parts of the AA message. So it was vitally important that the story of the book's origins be presented as a group effort rather than the work of just one man. And that's what it was, just one man. Let's continue. I want to get to something else real important. Um, Rob, let's give me another page. Uh, okay. There are unfortunately no documents mentioning the actual writing of the steps. So now, at arguably the single most significant moment in our history, we rely solely on the stories Bill Wilson told 55, 56, 53, and so on. There's not one document preserved from December of 38 or the months immediately after that to either confirm or contradict his versions. It's simply not mentioned anywhere. It's not recorded anywhere. Compounding the problem was raising suspicion about Bill's absolute accuracy here is the fact that the first recorded instance of him telling that well-known story is in a letter he wrote to the journalist Jack Alexander in 1949, 11 years after the event. How so much time could have elapsed without this important story being told is a mystery. The first mention of this story being written this way was told in 1941. It's significant because we're all depending on, this is all based on Bill's telling the story. Let's jump ahead a little bit because we are running out of time. The sixth step myth. We're talking about there being 6 steps, right? Earl Treat told about the 6 steps that he worked with Dr. Bob. 1955. Remember, that's when it was written. Next, the 6 step myth I want to get to, Rob, towards the end. There we go. The 6 step myth. Okay. There is no evidence that there was ever any formal set of 6 steps. None. People who like things neat and tidy with lists to memorize tend to get carried away with the idea of 6 steps and imagining early AA meetings with the window shade on the walls displaying the 6 steps like we have the 12 steps, with everyone sitting around and analyzing those 6 steps like we analyze the 12 steps. It never happened. Never happened. Next page. There is simply no mention of the 6 step word of mouth program until 1949 when Bill mentioned it to Jack Alexander. That's the first time the 6 steps ever came up anywhere. Next page, we're wrapping it up. Despite Bill's claim that the 6 steps harken back to the very beginning, they did not. In Bill's story, he acknowledged that the program of recovery changed considerably since Ebby's visit. It certainly evolved to the point where there was some sort of routine helping people stay sober, but there's no mention of anything in the early records, even remotely resembling a 6 step program. In Wilson's defense, it could be claimed that the historian's maxim, absence of evidence is not proof of absence of evidence, might apply here. But there actually is a tremendous amount of contemporary documentation showing exactly what people were doing to get sober before Bill wrote the 12 steps, and none of it suggests anything like a 6 step program. And I'm going to stop there. We've got a couple more pages to go, but I don't want to go that late. And I'm sorry I took so much time, Steve. I didn't plan on going that deep, but I got inspired.
It's perfect because we don't have to go on one paragraph into how it works, and I think everything Howard explained, I like the part where, you know, the most important part about Bill sitting down on Clinton Street and writing it was when he regained, he says in that, when I regained my ability to think. And he just, and I think what he's saying is when I connected to God within me, because that shows you this book was divinely inspired, how it flowed out. Because ask him 50, 30 minutes later to recreate it again or do something that deep. He couldn't. It was divinely, and the question is that's another form of spiritual experience, in my opinion. And which spiritual experience is more important, the one he had in the hospital or the one he had when he wrote How It Works? It's just my thought, because very divinely inspired, because you think about it, when we walk into Alcoholics Anonymous, none of the stuff that we look at and how it works is the reason we walked into Alcoholics Anonymous. We carried it with us in Alcoholics Anonymous. We didn't go into AA and say, I'm going to AA because I have resentments and bad sex conduct and I hold on to pride and I got low self-esteem. No, we went there because we were beat up because we're alcoholics dragging our feet in there. And there's a reason why so many people are dry drunks in Alcoholics Anonymous, because this stuff scares the crap out of people. None of these people drank because a lot of us drank because we didn't want to look at this stuff. They didn't want to be reminded of this stuff that we're going to go over in this chapter. Like I said, I never got past the first 3 steps. I did at least 4 third steps. The last one I did before the very last one was somewhat genuine, but the best way I could describe it, and this is something that I heard a guy explain it like this out of the book, but he says it's kind of an interesting story. So he's I walk. This is the way I explain to people going in and out of the program for years. I walked down the street. I fell in a deep, I fell in a deep hole in the sidewalk that I didn't see. I got hurt, got beat up, scratched a little bit. I laid in there for a long time and somehow climbed my way out. I walked down the same street. I knew there was a hole, in the sidewalk. I pretended I didn't see it, and I can't believe I fell and it's right down the same hole again. Suffered with pain and anxiety. Can't believe I'm in the hole again. Took me even longer to get out. I walked down the same street. I knew the hole's there. I see it approaching. I fall right into it, you know, but I'm still thinking, it isn't my fault I fell in this hole, even though it took longer to get out. And I walk down the same street. There's the deep hole. I fell in again. I'm lost. I'm hopeless. I'm stuck in the hole. I barely get out. I walk down the same street, fall in the hole. I walk around it. I walk down the same street. I walk around it. I walk around it. Then I fall in the hole one more time and I get out. Then I decide to walk down a different street. And walking down a different street is a journey to the unknown where we go, you know what? Maybe I need to do these steps. That journey to the unknown is step 4, right? But to get us prepared for step 4, step 3 is like the table setting. The bonus today is I get to walk down any street I want to walk down, and it's a journey from ordinary to extraordinary. That's why I look at it. Extraordinary is this invisible place within yourself, you know, where we can continue to connect to, and where your life becomes, this endless fountain of opportunity. It all begins with this chapter. 49 is our, road to change, a new way of life. That's that was the first books I ever did on my own was called A New Way of Life. And, you know, we're gonna look at that. We're gonna dissect it. I think we set the table pretty well, and we'll dissect it next week. And I'm gonna stop the recording, and we'll go on to anyone who wants to share.